好，我们现在开始讲今天下午的课，然后今天下午的课呢，我们继续讲啊，今天我们上午讲的一些还没有讲到的一些内容。
So we are going on to our afternoon teaching now, and what we're going to be addressing is the remaining content related to our morning teaching.
然后我们就是这些佛教的这些课呢，我们听课之前每次都需要发菩提心的。
And prior to listening to a Buddhist teaching, it's important every time that we generate an aspiration of bodhicitta.
然后比如说我们像大学里面的课程或者是有些特殊的地方的课程呢，那我们没有要求发菩提心，因为这个当中就不一定大家都是学佛的人。
Classes or teachings that are given in other places, like in universities or in some other locations, there is no request made prior to the teaching that everybody make a aspiration of bodhicitta, because it isn't necessarily the case that everybody present is a Buddhist.
但是就是佛教徒尤其是我们学大乘佛教的，那么就前提的条件是要有菩提心，就是要学习菩提心。
However, for Buddhists, and especially for Mahayana Buddhists, one of our preconditions is that we learn about and cultivate bodhicitta.
所以我们在这个听课的之前简单的说一下菩提心。
So that is why prior to the teaching, I'm giving a simple overview of bodhicitta.
首先，菩提心要具备两个条件。
There are two conditions that need to be fulfilled in order for us to have bodhicitta.
首先，我们学佛的时候呢，我们每一个人都花很多的时间，然后就去学佛、学习打坐。然后呢，就是做很多的事情。那么这些事情就必须要有一个目标。
As students of Buddhism, we invest a lot of time on studying, on practicing, on engaging in a lot of activities. It's important that all of these things have a goal, that we do them in respect of a particular goal.
然后这个目标就可以有两个目标。
And it's possible that goal can be divided into two, or that we can have two goals.
首先，第一个我们就是希望所有的众生这个就是所谓的所有的众生，这个当中呢，就是包含了天下所有的生命这个不分信仰不分人种。不分国家不分这个生命的各种各样的这个层次凡是生命都在这个当中。
So the first of these is our aspiration that we make in respect of all living beings. And this aspiration includes all sentient beings, with no distinction on the basis of religion, ethnicity, nationality, or even in terms of different forms of life.
然后我们就是对所有的众生，发慈悲心，也就是希望发自内心的衷心的希望所有的众生离开所有的痛苦这叫做这个悲心。
So the first part of this aspiration entails us generating the very deep wish from the bottom of our heart that all beings be free from suffering. And this is the compassion aspect of this aspiration.
然后所有的众生我们衷心的希望这样子的这个众生所有的众生能够活得幸福快乐永远都拥有 幸福和快乐啊。这种想法，这种心愿，就叫做慈啊。慈和悲啊，也有一点点的不一样。
And along with this, we also make the aspiration that all living beings achieve happiness and that they enjoy happiness always. And this aspect of our aspiration is what we refer to as loving kindness.
然后我们对所有的众生真正的有这样子的这个慈悲心以后呢，然后我们就会想到那我这样子发愿还不够我要去做一件事情我要去做让所有众生这个拥有幸福的事情也同时也要去做让一切众生远离这个痛苦的这样子的事情我要去做，光是发这样子的愿不行那这个时候就会出现一个这样子的想法。
Having made this aspiration, we then develop the awareness that simply having the wish that all beings be free from happiness and enjoy, be free from suffering and enjoy happiness is not sufficient, that we now need to engage in concrete action to bring this about. So this from our aspiration to see all beings be free from suffering and have happiness comes a willingness to engage in concrete action.
这个时候呢，我们去想那我怎么样去做目前我什么能力都没有我把自己的这些问题烦恼都不能解决，都没有这个能力。那么我怎么样让所有的众生拥有幸福，所有的众生远离痛苦呢？我应该怎么去做呢？然后我们会去思考这个问题。
And at this point, we'll find ourselves asking ourselves, well, how should I do this? What can I do to ensure all beings achieve happiness and free from suffering? At present, I don't have any capacity really to bring this about, given that I'm already beset with my own problems and afflictions. So we go on to think about how we can best go about concretely benefiting other beings.
这个时候我们会发现有一个方法是什么呢？如果我就像我也比如说拥有像释迦牟尼佛这样子的智慧像释迦牟尼佛这样子的慈悲心也就是说我跟佛一样有可能有一天达到这个水平这样子的话，我就能够就帮助很多的众生所以呢我要成佛，所以我一定要成佛，下定决心无论是需要多长时间花多长时间，我都愿意我一定要成佛这个时候就会有一个这样子的决心。
And in thinking in this way, we will discover that the best method that will allow us to do this is to achieve the wisdom of the Shakyamuni Buddha and the compassion of the Shakyamuni Buddha. And so we then make a very firm resolution, a very firm resolve to attain the same level of wisdom and compassion as the Buddha, so that we will then be capable to go about benefiting all beings. So we make this very firm resolve that however long it takes us to do it, we ultimately will achieve the state of Buddhahood.
好，这个时候呢，我们又去思考那我怎么样能够成佛成佛，我要想达到释迦牟尼佛的这种水平、这种标准怎么样达到？方法是什么这个时候我们会思考这个。
And then we'll find ourselves thinking, well, how should I go about achieving this, the state of the Buddha? How can I go about reaching that standard? What method can I use?
这个时候呢，我们会发现需要成佛那就需要3个条件。
And we will come to realize that in order to achieve Buddhahood, it's necessary that we fulfill 3 conditions.
第一个就是需要出离心。
The first of these is a mind of renunciation.
然后第二就需要菩提心，
The second is bodhicitta.
然后第三就是要真悟空心，
And the third is a realization of emptiness.
需要这个真悟的智慧。
We need the wisdom of realizing emptiness.
然后这个菩提心菩提心当中的这个慈悲心和真悟的这个智慧这两个慈悲和智慧有这两个，然后呢，这个慈悲和这个智慧从最低就最后就把它培养到最高的境界，那这个时候就是成佛了。这样子我们就发现有一个方法让我们可以成佛。
And we will come to appreciate that if we are able to have the compassion of bodhicitta and the wisdom of having realized emptiness, that armed with these two things, if we nurture them, if we cultivate them from the very smallest extent and grow them to a very large extent, then we will be ultimately able to achieve Buddhahood by these means.
这个时候我们下定决心，让自己拥有智慧，让自己拥有慈悲心，然后就是为了这个目标就是我们开始今天我们上午讲的开始闻思修然后就走这条路。
So in making a very firm decision that we wish to possess and cultivate wisdom and compassion, making the cultivation of these two things our goal, then we embark on the path, as we mentioned this morning, of listening, contemplating, and meditating.
那我们听课的时候呢，就是要有这样子的这个菩提心我一定要成佛。成佛是为了什么呢？为了帮助所有的众生，为了帮助所有的众生，我一定要成佛。为了成佛我现在开始学习修心就是要这样子，这个就是菩提心那我们每一次听课的时候、打坐的时候做任何善事都必须要有这个菩提心。
So when we come and listen to this teaching today, we should do so with an aspiration of bodhicitta. That is, we should come and listen to the class with the goal of achieving Buddhahood. And for what purpose? In order to give benefit to all beings. So it is in order to achieve Buddhahood to benefit all beings that we study and that we practice. It's important that every time we listen to a class or we meditate or we engage in any kind of virtuous action, that we do so with this aspiration of bodhicitta.
好，我们发了这样子的菩提心以后呢接下来我们继续看今天早上的图，然后我们继续讲一讲今天早上的这个图的其他的内容。
So once everyone has made this aspiration in their own minds, we will continue with what we were talking about this morning. If everyone would bring their attention to the diagram.
这个图上面我们讲的这个8个或者是9个这个层次，那这个就是佛教里面平时呢佛教里面就讲8识，尤其是佛教的唯识宗大乘佛教的唯识宗，把人的整个的这个精神世界分成8个不同的层次这8个在佛教里面就叫做8识。
So these 8 or 9 layers that we see represented here on the diagram what Buddhism typically divides the consciousness into these 8 levels and refers to them as the 8 consciousnesses, especially in the Yogacara tradition.
然后还有一个 有一些派啊，就是佛教的有一些派啊，他们也有90啊、80上面啊，再加上这个如来藏啊，这样子就是叫做90啊，这样子的说法，有80和90啊两种这个观点啊，但是这两个观点都是不矛盾的。
There are some schools of Buddhism, however, that add the extra level or extra layer, that of the Buddha nature, and talk of 9 consciousnesses rather than 8 consciousnesses. But in any case, whether we speak of 8 consciousnesses or 9, there's no conflict between these two systematizations.
然后这个80它的这个顺序啊，诞生的时候，我们的最原始的，也就是从无始以来存在的就是这个佛心啊，它是最基本的啊，它是从无始以来就最早的时候就是存在的，它是所有的我们的情绪包括这个阿赖耶识啊，全部的基础，实际上就是所有的东西都是从这个佛心当中产生的。
Of these 8 layers or 9 layers, the most fundamental or elemental or primordial of them is the Buddha nature. The Buddha nature is the originary layer from which everything else arises, so including the storehouse consciousness and all of the emotions that arise from that.
所以这个佛心它是最原始的状态。
So Buddha nature is the most primordial state.
我们人如果有一个自我，那么这个自我就是应该是这个佛心才叫做自我，才是自我。因为除了佛心以外的其他的这些所有东西所有包括我们的身体还有我们的情绪这些都是不是自我，因为这些都是时有时无，变化无常。
In fact, if we had to speak of there being a self, then we would probably have to call the Buddha nature the self, from the perspective that everything else, our physical bodies, our emotions, the other components of our mind, are fleeting or dynamic, they're changeable, they're not enduring.
有些时候有些佛经，有些个别的佛经当中就是这个佛心就是以这个自我这样子的名词来形容。
In some Buddhist sutras, the Buddha nature, in fact, is described as self.
但是这种自我实际上跟我们现在我们每一个都认为有一个自我的存在这个是完全是两回事不是这种自我。
However, the way that self is used in this context is very different from the ordinary sense of self that we all regard ourselves as having. They're very different usages or concepts.
这种佛心我们也可以不仅仅是佛经上讲也可以我们感觉到它的存在。
This kind of self, besides it's mentioned in the Buddhist sutras, it's also something that we ourselves can perceive.
感觉到它的存在，什么时候感觉到它的存在？就是当我们证悟的时候，然后就感觉到它的存在。
So when is it that we are able to perceive the existence of this self? Well, we're able to do so the moment that we achieve awakening, or the moment we recognize the essential nature of our mind.
然后这个佛心呢，它就是像，比如说古筝古筝就是中国的一种乐器，古筝上面的这个弦发出声音的这个弦一样的类似于它。为什么这么讲因为这个古筝上面的这个弦，如果没有人去动那么它是没有任何的声音的。如果没有震动，就是没有声音。
We can liken the Buddha nature to the Chinese harp called the guzheng, for the very reason that the Buddha nature, the strings of the harp, if no one plays them, they don't make a sound.
然后这个古琴的这弦或者吉他也是一样这都是这类的乐器都是一样。然后如果你手指头去轻轻的动一下古筝或者吉他它的这个弦，然后它震动了以后呢开始发出声音。
And the harp or the guitar or any kind of stringed instrument like this, as soon as you begin to slightly or lightly strum the strings, then because they are stimulated, they begin to produce a sound.
所以佛教还讲当我们人所有的人、动物还有任何一个生命还没有诞生的时候，没有诞生的时候，然后这个时候这个宇宙这个也就是说这个宇宙还没有诞生的时候，它的原始的状态就是这个状态。
And Buddhism tells us that the primordial state of the universe, prior to the arising of the universe, humans, animals, etc., the fundamental primordial state is like this.
然后这个时候我们的意识还没有诞生。
At this point, our minds, our consciousnesses have not yet arisen.
这个时候也没有轮回这样子的概念。
And there's no concept of cyclic existence at this point.
人、动物以及其他的生命都没有出现，都没有这样子的概念。
And there's no concept or notion of humans or animals or other forms of life.
那这个时候没有轮回，也没有佛。
At this point, there's no cyclic existence. There's also no Buddha.
那么佛、轮回这些都是后来之后的诞生的这个之前呢这个状态当中呢，这些都是不存在的。
In fact, cyclic existence, Buddhas, etc., these are all things that subsequently have arisen. They are not existent in the primordial or prior state.
但是因为这个时候没有人去修心证悟没有证悟，这些概念都没有的，所以呢在这个原始的这个状态当中，随时都有可能出现这个我们的意识的产生人类或者其他动物或者其他生命的意识从这个当中有可能随时都可以产生。
Neither is there any enlightenment or concept of enlightenment in this state either. However, what this state does possess is the omnipresent potential of the arising of consciousness, whether that be human consciousness or animal consciousness.
然后呢，就是比如说这个乐器上面的这个弦震动了以后呢，发出声音或者是这个之前比如说几百个古筝几千个这个吉他都放在这里，但是没有人去动它的这个琴它的弦的时候 然后没有声音啊，这房间里面就不会有任何的声音一样啊。这个时候虽然这个佛心它存在啊，但是不会有任何的其他的众生生命的意识啊。这个时候意识阿赖耶识啊这些都没有诞生。
So it's just like a room that has 100 harps or 1,000 guitars in it. If there is no one to play their strings, then no sound is produced. And in just the same way, Buddha nature in the primordial state exists. However, in this primordial state, there are no beings, there's no consciousness, the storehouse consciousness, etc. All of these have not yet arisen.
然后这个时候如果我们用手指去碰一下这个乐器的线，然后它开始震动震动了以后就开始产生各种各样的声音。
However, if we were now to bring our hand to the strings of the instrument and strum them, then they would vibrate and produce all kinds of sound.
然后最后就是变成了一个交响乐各种各样的这个音乐。
And ultimately would become an orchestra with producing all kinds of sounds.
那这个我们的宇宙轮回它就是这样子。
And our universe, cyclic existence, is also like this.
然后这个佛心当中开始产生我们的意识第一个出现的是什么？第一个出现就是这个阿赖耶识它是第一个出来。
However, when Buddha nature does begin to give rise to consciousness, the first element or aspect that emerges is the storehouse consciousness.
然后出现了这个阿赖耶识以后呢意识也就随后就产生了。
And then after the arising of the storehouse consciousness comes the arising of our mental consciousness.
然后这个意识呢它就变成两部分，一个是向外的然后另外一个是向内的意识就变成两个。
And this mental consciousness becomes comprised of two parts. One part which is externally oriented, and one part which is internally oriented.
然后向内的这部分的这个意识，然后呢，它面对什么呢？它就面对阿赖耶识然后它就是对阿赖耶识产生了一种自我的这个感觉，他认为这是自我，他认为这是我这样子，然后就形成了这个倒数第二就是末那识。
And the part of the mental consciousness which is internally oriented orients itself to the storehouse consciousness, and as we mentioned before, begins to regard that as itself. So it develops a self-awareness, and this is what we refer to as the deluded mental consciousness.
然后这种自我是我们证悟了以后当我们证悟了以后，就是它还在，细微的还在。
And in fact, this self-awareness is something that continues to exist even after we have achieved awakening. It continues to exist in a very faint capacity.
然后这个这种我执是我们的所有的我们日常生活当中的所有的烦恼所有的不开心的所有的这些负面的情绪的源头来源。
And it's this self-awareness or self-attachment which is the original cause of all of the affliction and unhappiness and negative emotions that we experience in our everyday lives.
然后有了这个自我，有了这个自我以后呢，然后我们把人把生命就分很多很多的级别我他。然后我方他方等等，分很多很多的这个不同的层次，而且把人类当中或者是在这个生命的这个群体当中，我们画很多很多的界限把这个界限画得特别的清楚。
Once we have this sense of self-attachment or self-awareness, then we begin to delineate or carve up life into all different segments and layers and levels. So to begin with, we have self and other, mine and theirs. We begin to draw all kinds of lines and boundaries within within living beings.
然后这样子分了很多界限划清了界限以后，然后这个不同的层次不同的这个群体之间，然后就产生很多的烦恼斗争、战争等等。
So once we do this, we divide phenomena up into levels and groups. Then we begin to have all kinds of problems, conflicts, war, struggle, etc.
然后这个意识我们刚才讲了，还有一个是向外的，然后向外的这个部分，然后他就去判断分析，然后这样子以后呢，我们的所有的我们的价值观世界观、人生观这些都就逐步都形成了。
And that part of our mental consciousness, which is oriented externally, evaluates phenomena, analyzes it, and in due course our values, our world outlook, etc. come into being.
然后最细微的这个意识我们的最细微的意识诞生的时候呢，然后就同时形成了我们的身体形成了我们的身体，然后身体就形成的同时这个感官都产生，感官产生了以后呢，然后听觉、视觉这些也就诞生了。
So from the very faintest arising of consciousness co-emerges our physical body, and with our physical body, from our physical body comes sensory faculties, and with that we have our eye consciousness, our ear consciousness, and so forth.
然后我们的感官产生了以后，我们就用我们现在的这个感官来看这个世界，然后他看到的绝大多数都是错误，就没有看到世界的真相。
And as soon as our sensory faculties have been formed, then we use them, we rely on them to perceive the external world. However, the vast majority of what our sensory faculties perceive is in fact a misperception. Very seldom do our sensory faculties perceive the truth of the external world.
然后他看到的这些不真实的东西看到了以后呢，然后我们的感官把这个不真实的这个信息，他把传递给我们的意识传递给我们的意识。
And when our eyes perceive phenomena that are not real, then this information it transmits to our minds.
然后我们的意识就接受到了这些不真实的这个信息以后呢，然后他就根据这些错误的信息，然后 他会建立很多很多自己的观点。
Once our mental consciousness receives this information, these mistaken perceptions, then on the basis of these mistaken perceptions, it will begin to establish all kinds of opinions and views.
那么这些观点的基础都是错误的基础都是我们的这个意识给他传递的这些错误的信息，所以他在这个这个错误的基础信息上建立起来的这些观点那都是错误的。
Because the foundation that our mental consciousnesses establish their views and opinions on is mistaken itself, then in fact our views and opinions are based on mistaken perceptions, and therefore these views and opinions themselves are mistaken.
好，最后就形成了我们今天的这个轮回。
And then ultimately, this all results in cyclic existence.
然后佛法的意思大乘佛教的意思呢，就是让我们要回归。
And so the purpose of Buddhism, the purpose of Mahayana Buddhism, is for us to recuperate or to return.
就是回归到最原始的状态。
To return to our original primordial state.
当然我们现在就是每一个人都过的生活就是我们现在这样子的生活，然后让我们去回归的话，那我们很多人会想那回归了以后我们会是一个什么样的状态呢？我们人回归了以后会怎么生活呢？我们以现在的这个标准来衡量，然后我们也会产生了很多很多的担忧。
Of course, many people would wonder, well, leading the lives that we currently do, how could we return to this primordial state? How could we possibly continue to live our lives in this state?
有些时候呢，我们会产生一些恐惧。
And on this basis give rise to worries and sometimes fear.
这个就是因为我们现在就是因为我们现在生活在一个这样子的状态当中，然后呢，让我们要进入另外一个状态，那因为这个状态跟我们的差距落差比较大，所以我们有些时候产生恐惧。比如说我们有些人呢稍微感觉到一点点这个空心的时候那就是有些人会害怕，会产生恐惧。
And the reason for this fear is the prospect of transitioning from our current state of living to one that is extremely distant or different from it. For example, sometimes when people begin to get the first taste of emptiness, they can give rise to fear.
那这个就是一个轮回的诞生的过程，就是比如说一个乐器，它根本没有声音，到最后就是变成了一个交响乐这样子的一个过程。然后我们的这个轮回一开始的时候呢，就是没有任何的佛众生最后呢就形成了这么一个庞大的这个轮回过程，就是这样子。
So this is how cyclic existence arises. It's like an instrument that is just sitting there before it is played, eventually developing into an orchestra. And so too is it with the cosmos to begin with. There is no Buddha, there are no beings, but ultimately we result in this vast samsaric system.
然后我们现在佛就是说我们的内心当中有一个佛心有佛心但是我们现在我们没有开悟的时候，我们感觉不到这个佛心的存在。
And what the Buddha tells us is that within our inner mind is Buddha nature. However, prior to awakening, we are not able to perceive its existence.
那我们这个佛心和这个阿赖耶这两个它是两个一个硬币的两面这样子，面朝我们的面对我们的这一部分就是阿赖耶然后呢我们看不到感觉不到的这一面就是佛心。
In fact, we can liken our Buddha nature and the storehouse consciousness to different sides of the same coin. So the side of the coin that faces upwards is the storehouse consciousness, and the side of the coin that faces downwards that we can't see or perceive is like our Buddha nature.
然后我们的手臂这个皮肤肌肉下面有骨头有骨骼大家都知道，但是我们的肉眼是没有办法看到。
It's the same with the skin on our arm. Everybody knows that beneath our skin there is muscle, and that beneath the muscle there is bone. This is something that everybody knows but can't see.
但是如果我们的肉眼接住一个工具，这样子的话，它也可以看得到里面的骨头。
However, if our eyes are able to use an appropriate instrument, then it is possible for us to see the bone.
这个就是 X 光通过 X 光然后我们看到很清楚了，这里面就有骨头的存在。
And this instrument is the X-ray. If we use an X-ray, we can very clearly see that there is bone under our skin.
我们现在往里看，往我们的心里看的时候，我们平时怎么样看怎么认真的去观察、去感受，也感觉不到这个佛心的存在。
In our present state, when we look inwards, no matter how deeply we try to observe or watch, we still cannot perceive our Buddha nature.
那我们的意识，我们现在的意识，如果它也能够用上接住一种工具，这样子的话，它也可以感觉得到。
However, if our consciousness were able to make use of an instrument or an apparatus, then it would be able to perceive the Buddha nature.
那这个工具当然不是 X 光。
But this apparatus, of course, is not an X-ray machine.
这个是什么呢？这就是智慧。
What it is wisdom.
智慧从哪里来？
Where does this wisdom come from?
智慧，我们比如说像大圆满大手印这些当中来自于这些。
This kind of wisdom derives from the practices like the Great Perfection practices or the Mahamudra practices.
如果我们在大圆满、大手印以及比如说像禅宗这些当中的这个方法智慧，我们得到了以后呢，然后用这个智慧一看然后我们立即就发现我们的心中确实有一个佛心的存在。
If we're able to take the wisdom or use the wisdom generated from Dzogchen practice or Mahamudra practice or Chan practice to take these methods and their wisdom and we will be able to immediately perceive the existence of our Buddha nature.
但是我们人还活着的时候因为有这个五个感官的干扰还有就是我们的意识的干扰还有就是莫那识的干扰，还有这些干扰都存在，还有尤其是有这个阿赖耶识的干扰，这么多的干扰所以我们所看到的这个佛心是非常的模糊的。
Even though we are able to, on the basis of this wisdom, perceive directly our Buddha nature, because in our present lives we still have the disruption of our 5 sensory consciousnesses, our mental consciousness, our deluded mental consciousness, and especially our storehouse consciousness, the Buddha nature that we perceive is rather blurry.
所以我们人还活着的时候再好的真悟也就永远都达不到这个中阴的时候中阴的时候我们讲过这个中间就是有一个连阿赖耶识都停止的这个一个这样子的空间我们的这个真悟永远都达不到这个我们的真悟的这个清晰度永远都达不到这个中阴的时候的这个时候的这个清晰我们平时都没办法达到。
So it's before this reason that in our present waking lives that even the best enlightenment is unable to rival that which it may be achieved in the intermediate state. So as we spoke about before, that moment when our storehouse consciousness ceases, when we're able to directly perceive our Buddha nature, the recognition of the essence of mind that we're able to achieve in our ordinary waking lives can never rival the clarity that we can achieve in the intermediate state.
但是中阴的时候的这个是非常非常的清楚的，这个光明是非常清楚的虽然它非常的清楚，因为没有任何的干扰，但是如果我们没有现在我们人活着的时候的这种比较模糊的这个真悟那么到时候我们没有办法这个认识到这个光明。
Even though the recognition of mind that we are able to have during the intermediate state is extremely luminous because there are no other disturbances taking place, if during our living existences we are not first able to achieve this relatively blurry state of enlightenment or recognition of mind, then it won't be possible for us to recognize it in the intermediate state.
所以我们现在人活着的时候的这个真悟虽然它的这个清晰度没有那么的高虽然有点模糊，但是如果没有它那我们后面的这个中阴的这些所有的这些修法都根本是没有办法修的。
So during our current living existences, even though the clarity of our enlightenment or our realization may not be of the highest degree, without it, then all of the subsequent practices that we can put into place during the intermediate state are of no use.
还有一个非常重要的一个事情我们平时一般的人来讲，这个中阴的光明它瞬间就会过去的但是比如说真悟的人如果在这个真悟的境界当中如果他能够停留5分钟或者是10分钟这样子的话，那到时候在中阴的时候这个中阴的光明它一定会停止5分钟10分钟，甚至是更长，所以那个时候去这个感受去进入这个状态都来得及。
So for most people, this moment of luminosity that takes place in the dying process is very short, just a split second. However, if in our waking lives we are able to abide in the enlightened state for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, then when the storehouse consciousness ceases, it will be possible for this luminosity to appear, this aperture to appear for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or potentially longer, and we'll be able to perceive it for this length of time and abide in this state for this length of time.
所以我们现在的这个真悟是最关键我们就是大家要争取就是这一生的这个真悟。
So the enlightenment that we achieve in this life is really the most critical. This is something that everybody should strive to achieve.
然后我们真悟了以后呢就真悟的时候呢就是通过这个大圆满大受因这些方法，通过这些方法，然后就自己就非常清楚地感觉到这个佛心的存在。就是自己可以非常清楚的可以自己就感受得到，不需要依靠佛经呢不需要依靠其他的，就是自己直接可以感觉得到。
So through the methods of Dzogchen or Mahamudra, it is possible to directly oneself perceive one's Buddha nature without reliance on other things.
所以我们今天早上也讲过了，那这个当中它没有教条的这个成分，也没有信仰的成分我们只是心里就相信有这么一个东西存在但是永远都感觉不到不是这样子的现在目前这个阶段我们没有办法去这个感受但是现在呢，我们的肉眼看我们的手臂，我们也看不到这个里面有骨头但是我们相信有。
So just as we said this morning, these teachings, there's nothing dogmatic about them, and there's nothing that hinges on belief, blind belief. For example, something that is posited but that we never have the capacity to experience for ourselves. So even though in our present state we might not be able to perceive what we're talking about here, nevertheless it's the same with other things. For example, our naked eye not being able to perceive the bone beneath our skin, even though we can't see it, nevertheless we believe in its existence.
好，然后还有一个这个辅助这个阿赖耶识阿赖耶识它就像一个从某种程度上讲它就像一个这个佛心的提升在哪个比如说演员他演电影的时候，他有个提升比如说我做不到的，让你去做
replacement, substitute, surrogate. Yeah. Okay, so we can say that the storehouse consciousness is a surrogate of the Buddha nature.
所以我们第一个我们打坐的时候呢，第一个我们见到的看到的就是这个提升，还不是他真实的人。所以我们打坐的时候，第一个看到的就是这个提升这个阿赖耶识。
So when we first begin to meditate, that which we first perceive is this surrogate, not the Buddha nature itself.
然后提升和这个真实的角色这两个虽然不是一个人，是两个人，但是呢有一个很相通的地方否则的话不能做它的提升。
So even though the surrogate that we see, the replacement, is not the real person, nevertheless there is a great similarity between the two. Otherwise, the surrogate would not be able to perform that role of surrogacy.
所以我们很多的修行人，非常非常多的修行人就感觉到这个阿赖耶识的时候，就以为自己真悟了。
So there are a lot of practitioners who, when they perceive the storehouse consciousness, believe themselves to have recognized the primordial state of mind.
因为像大圆满、大手印还有就是像禅宗这些非常高深的这些佛法里面讲到的这些所有的这些词、所有的名词类似的东西，在这个阿赖耶识上面都能够找得到。
And the reason for this is that within the advanced practice traditions of Dzogchen, Mahamudra, and Chan, the various words and expressions that are used to describe these states can also be located at the level of the storehouse consciousness.
所以我们打坐的时候比如说我们看看大圆满、大手印，然后呢，大手印、大圆满讲的这些空性还有很多的光明等等这些所有的这些东西类似的东西，我们在这个打坐的时候，在这个阿赖耶识的这个状态当中都能够感受到。
So the concepts such as emptiness and luminosity that are described in the context of Dzogchen and Mahamudra practice, states similar to these can all be located in meditation at the level that reaches the level of the storehouse consciousness.
所以很多人就是进入了这个阿赖耶识的时候呢，就是因为他经验不丰富大坐的经验不丰富或者是没有一个正确的引导这样子以后呢，就是认为自己证悟了大圆满、大手印或者是禅宗就会导致一些这样子的错误的这个理解。
So it's for this reason that many practitioners, if they've not had a great deal of meditation experience or they don't have proper guidance, believe when they observe these things or experience these things at the level of the storehouse consciousness that they have achieved awakening. But this is in fact a mistaken understanding.
所以比如说非常有经验的这些修行人就把我们的意识就像剥洋葱一样这样一层一层一层一层的剥开，最后把我们的如来藏就指给我们看，那么这个叫做直指人心。
So a very experienced meditator is able to peel away at the layers of consciousness just like the layers of an onion until what is left to point at is the basic nature of mind. And this is called pointing out the basic nature of mind.
然后这个阿赖耶识的这个状态当中我们不突破这个阿赖耶识，就停留在阿赖耶识的层面上，然后就可以修很多很多的禅定就像四禅八定佛教也修四禅八定，然后就是除了佛教以外比较古老的这个印度教他们也修四禅八定，这些非常好的禅定都可以在这个阿赖耶识上面可以修，也就是说不破坏阿赖耶识的情况下就可以修这些禅定。
There are, however, without breaking through or transcending the storehouse consciousness, there are many meditation methods that we can practice at this level. So the core example would be jhana meditation. Buddhism has jhana meditation, so too does the Hindu tradition from India, and these are all very good meditation practices. These are meditation practices that we can do that do not penetrate or go beyond the storehouse consciousness.
比如说在这个阿赖耶识当中，如果禅定修得好的话，3天5天3、5天当中没有任何的念头一个念头都没有就这么一个非常平静的状态当中安住可以3天5天都没问题那么就是这么长时间安住这当中的时候呢，然后就是没有念头，没有任何念头，从这个角度跟这个大圆满还有大受音他们所描述的这个佛心这个佛心是非常非常接近的。
It is possible at the level of the storehouse consciousness to engage in meditation, that a state of meditative concentration or absorption that lasts between 3 or 5 days. So 3 to 5 days without one single discursive thought, no mental activity, just 3 to 5 days of abiding in a state of pure equanimity. This state of abiding in equanimity is very close to the Dzogchen and Mahamudra states of recognizing the basic nature of mind.
就像在外太空失重一样，就是大坐的时候，在这个境界当中就是感觉上失去了整个的身体，感觉不到身体的存在。
So the feeling is similar to being in space with a loss of gravity, and this kind of meditative absorption, one loses all sense of having a physical body.
但是这个还不是真悟，这是阿赖耶识的一种禅定而已。
However, this is not the state of awakening. This is just a state of meditative absorption.
然后时间上一大坐的时候，比如说5个小时、7个小时过去了但是感觉上只有5分钟这样子的这个时间但是根本不是真悟，跟真悟一点都没有关系。
Even though a person might be able to abide in this state for 5 to 7 hours, in fact this time might pass as if it were 5 minutes, nevertheless this state has nothing to do with enlightenment or the enlightened state.
比如说我们有一个人能够5天大坐不吃不喝的大坐，然后没有任何的念头，这样子的话，那我们一定会认为我已经达到了很高很高的境界了。
We would ordinarily think that if a practitioner is able to meditate continuously for 5 days, eating nothing, not sleeping, without any mental activity whatsoever, that this person had achieved a very high state of practice.
但是这个还根本不是一种境界这是我们的心很平静而已平时我们不知道，因为我们不太了解我们的心内心是什么样子，平时我们都不太关注的关注的人他们会知道的。那么我们的内心如果训练的话，可以训练成这么平静但是呢，这跟解脱有没有关系？没有任何关系。
In actual fact, this state isn't even a state of realization. It's just the mind in a very still, calm and equanimous condition. So the reason that people would mistakenly think this to be a state of realization would be due to a lack of understanding of the mind. In actual fact, it is possible for us to train the mind, to exercise it so that it can achieve this kind of very calm and still condition. However, this has no connection with spiritual liberation.
然后有些时候呢，也就会有一些比如说像大圆满或者很多佛经上描述的这种光明类似于这种光明的这样子的感觉特别的像佛经上描述的这个光明就是自己从内心当中会找到一个非常相似的东西，但是也不是光明，还是在这个阿赖耶识。
And it's possible to locate in one's meditation experience a feeling or an experience that seems very similar to the luminosity that is described in Dzogchen texts and in Buddhist sutras. But in actual fact, this is not the luminosity that is described or intended here. The feeling or experience one is having is still at the level of the storehouse consciousness.
所以这个阿赖耶识跟佛心，他们两个就像个双胞胎。
So we can say that the storehouse consciousness and the Buddha nature are rather like a pair of twins.
长得特别像。
They look very much like each other.
有些时候根本就分不清楚。
And in some cases, it's almost impossible to distinguish between the two.
只有他们的父母才分得清楚。
Only their parents can tell the difference.
所以我们有些时候就根本就到底是阿赖耶识还是佛心，我们根本分不清楚。
So sometimes we're just really not able to distinguish whether or not what we are experiencing is the Buddha nature or the storehouse consciousness.
只有真悟的人，真正的真悟的人才能够分得清楚。
It's only truly realized, truly enlightened people that are able to distinguish between the two.
因为真悟的人他把这些东西都经历了已经经历了，已经超越了，所以他是非常清楚的。
For the reason that enlightened or realized practitioners have already experienced all these things and they've already transcended them themselves, so they're very clear about what's taking place.
所以我们打坐然后要想真悟的话，那我们必须要找到一个正悟的上师来给我们引导才可以的自己没有真悟的人，那就是根本没有办法让人真悟，没办法引导这个真悟的这些境界。
So it's important that if we want to practice meditation with the goal of achieving enlightenment, that we find for ourselves a teacher who themselves is enlightened to guide us. Someone who is not yet enlightened themselves is not able to guide someone in this process.
所以比如说密法尤其是大圆满当中，就是讲很多很多的这个阿赖耶识跟这个佛心的区别。
So it's for this reason that in the Vajrayana teachings, and particularly in the Dzogchen teachings, that a lot of explanation is devoted to distinguishing between the storehouse consciousness and Buddha nature.
然后他从各个方面讲他们的不一样的地方。他们虽然长得特别特别像，但是也有很多很多不一样的地方。
And in these teachings, the differences between the two are discussed from many different aspects. So even though they appear to be similar in many respects, they also have many differences.
我们还没有真悟的时候然后我们看到的绝大多数的都是相同的地方不一样的地方我们看不到。
Until we have actually achieved enlightenment, the majority of what we perceive are the similarities between these two, the storehouse consciousness and Buddha nature.
那是为什么就是因为这个阶段佛心我们的这个想象当中的佛心，我们都是看佛经看这些文字学来的从来都没有亲身体会过 啊。所以呢，我们会想啊，佛心大概也应该是这样子啊，就是佛心没有体会过，所以我们啊不一样的地方我们看得非常非常的知道的特别少啊，大多数都是我们看到都是比较像的地方。
The reason that we tend to notice the similarities between these two states is that up until this point, our understanding of the Buddha nature is derived from what we have read in Buddhist sutras and Buddhist texts. Up until this point, we lack experiential understanding of this state. So it's for this reason that we have very little experience of the differences between the two states and therefore concentrate on the similarities.
比如说啊，这个双胞胎当中，我们平时相处的就是其中一个另外一个我们从来没有看到过，但是有人告诉我另外一个也就跟他很像，描述过那我心目当中，我想象当中的另外一个双胞胎的另外一个人呢，就是我是从别人口里听来的自己从来没有看到过，所以我就想这个另外一个人呢，可能也大概也就是平时我接触的这个人一样这个时候呢，我只知道他们比较相同的地方了，然后肯定也有很多地方不同的地方，但不同的地方呢，我现在感觉不到，看不出来，因为这个因为没有跟另外这个人相处就是这样子。
So it's the same with a pair of twins. Let's just say that we only interact with one of these twins, yet someone else tells us that the other twin looks the same as the twin that we interact with. Well, in this case, in our imagination, we would imagine the other twin to look very similar to the one that we interact with usually. But this understanding or this picture in our minds is derived from the words of somebody else, not from our own direct observation. So for this reason, in our mind, the other twin we would imagine to look very similar to the person that we know. Presumably there are many differences between the two of them, but we don't know them, we're not able to see them because we only have contact with one twin.
然后当我们证悟了以后呢，我们才发现这两个有很多相同的地方但是呢，所谓的相同都是还不了解佛性的时候就觉得很像实际上真正看到了真实的这个佛性以后呢，然后就会发现有很多很多不一样的地方，原来这个不同的地方就远远超过相同的地方这个时候自己就非常的清楚了。
When we achieve enlightenment, we will discover that, in fact, the similarities that we believe to exist between the storehouse consciousness and Buddha nature, in fact, were due to the fact that we didn't have a proper understanding of the Buddha nature. However, once we gain direct experiential insight into our Buddha nature, then we will clearly understand that there are differences between the two, and that the differences between the storehouse consciousness and the Buddha nature far exceed the similarities.
所以我们就像一个科学家一样科学家把物质分解为分子，然后呢把分子再分解原子，然后呢把原子再分解电子、原子核，这样一步一步一层一层一层的分解，最后就是看到了最后就找到了最基本的这个粒子物质的最基本的单位这样子，然后我们也要从这个内心当中一层一层一层最后会发现最基本的就是佛心。
So just as a scientist analyzing matter breaks down matter from larger particles to smaller ones, so from molecules to atoms to electrons to nucleus, and this process is engaged in until the most basic particle is discovered. We need to do the same thing with our inner minds, that is, peel away at them layer by layer until finally we perceive our Buddha nature.
然后我们平时不打坐的时候，很多时候也可以进入到这个阿赖耶识的状态。
And it's possible for us, even when we're not meditating, to enter into the level of the storehouse consciousness.
比如说我们整天在外面工作，然后感到特别的疲惫，然后一回家门一打开，把东西一扔，沙发上一躺下来，发呆，这个时候的这种感觉比如说我们没有任何善恶的念头，什么念头都没有了，但是就是意识头脑还是清醒的，不像睡眠一样。这个时候的这种感觉就叫做阿赖耶识。
So, for example, let's say we've been outside working all day, we return home, we're extremely tired, we throw our stuff on the floor and lie on the sofa and go into a bit of a daze. Well, this state, when we are not giving rise to any kind of thought activity at all, no positive thoughts, no negative thoughts, and yet our mind is still clear, it's not like that we are asleep. Well, this is the storehouse consciousness.
好，今天我们的下午的课基本上就是这样子。这个当中我们把这个佛心和阿赖耶识，我们刚才讲了一大堆的这个相同的地方，那还有什么不一样的地方呢？不一样的地方我们要逐步的学习。
So that approximately brings our teaching for this afternoon to a conclusion. That is a discussion of a comparison of the Buddha nature and the storehouse consciousness. This afternoon we've mainly concentrated on the similarities between these two states. We haven't gone into yet the differences between them. This is something that we need to learn about gradually, step by step.
我们现在大家一起做一个回向。
So we're going to end now with a dedication of merit.
说能得当着三八年多年你别长南巴学，一个南极瓦隆这把这边做连着啊着人修。我们红板子个热板马色的红，我们红板子个热板马色的红，我们红板子个热板马色的。
Thank you very much, and Dashi Dele to everyone.